The Call of the Wild by John London. Chapter 6, read by Sumit Mishra for Browzly. When John Thornton froze his feet in the previous December, his partners had made him comfortable and left him to get well, going on themselves up the river to get out a raft of saw logs for Dawson. He was still limping slightly at the time he rescued Buck, but with continued warm weather, even the slight limp left him. And here, lying by the river bank through the long spring days, watching the running water, listening lazily to the songs of bird and hum of nature, Buck slowly won back his strength. A rest comes very good after one has traveled 3,000 miles, and it must be confessed that Buck waxed lazy as his wounds healed. His muscles swelled out, and the flesh came back to cover his bones. For that matter, they were all loafing. Buck, John Thornton, Skeet, Nig, waiting for the raft to come that was to carry them to Dawson. Skeet was a little Irish setter who early made friends with Buck, who in a dying condition was unable to resent her first advances. She performed her self appointed task till he came to look for her ministrations as much as he did for Thornton's. Nig, equally friendly though less demonstrative, was a huge black dog, half bloodhound and half deerhound, his eyes that laughed and a boundless good nature. To Buck's surprise, these dogs manifested no jealousy towards him. They seemed to share the kindness and largeness of John Thornton. As Buck grew stronger, they enticed him into all sorts of ridiculous games in which Thornton himself could not forbear to join, and in this fashion Buck romped through his convalescence and into a new existence. Love, genuine, passionate love, was his for the first time. This he had never experienced at Judge Miller's Down in sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley. With the judge's son hunting and tramping, it had been a working partnership. With judge's grandson, a sort of pompous guardianship, and with the judge himself, a safety and dignified friendship. But love that was feverish and burning, was adoration, was madness it had taken John Thornton to arouse. The man had saved his life, which was something, but further, he was ideal master. Other men saw to the welfare of their dogs from the sense of duty and business expediency. He saw to the welfare of his as if they were his own children, because he could not help it. He saw further. He never forgot a kindly greeting or a cheering word, and to sit down for a long talk with them was as much his delight as theirs. He had a way of taking Buck's head roughly between his hands and resting his own head upon Buck's, of shaking him back and forth, and while calling him ill names that to Buck were love names. Buck knew no greater joy than that rough embrace and the sound of murmured oaths. At each jerk back and forth, it seemed that his heart would be shaken out of his body, so great was its ecstasy. And when released, he sprang to his feet, his mouth laughing, his eyes eloquent, his throat vibrant with uttered sound, and in that fashion remained without movement. John Thornton would reverently exclaim, God, you can all but speak. Buck had a trick of love expression that was akin to hurt. He would often seize Thornton's hand in his mouth and close so fiercely that the flesh bore the impress of his teeth for some time afterwards. And as Buck understood the oaths to be love words, so the man understood fiend bites for a caress. For the most part, however, Buck's love was expressed in adoration. While he went wild with happiness when Thornton touched him or spoke to him, he did not seek these tokens. Unlike Skeet, who was wont to shove her nose under Thornton's hand and nudge till petted, or Nig, who would stalk up and rest his great head on Thornton's knee. Buck was content to adore at a distance. He would lie by the hour, eager, alert at Thornton's feet, looking up into his face, dwelling upon it, studying it, following with keenest interest each fleeting expression, every movement or change of future, or as chance might have it, he would lie farther away to the side or rear, watching the outlines of the man and occasional movement of his body. And often, such was the communion in which they lived, the strength of Buck's gaze would draw John Thornton's head around, and he would return the gaze without speech, his heart shining out of his eyes as Buck's heart shone out. For a long time after his rescue, Buck did not like Thornton to get out of his sight. From the moment he left the tent to when he entered it again, Buck would follow at his heels. His transient masters, since he had come into the Northland, had bred in him a fear that no master could be permanent. He was afraid that Thornton would pass out of his life as Perrault and Francois and the Scotch half bred had passed out. Even in the night, in his dreams, he was haunted by this fear. At such times, he would shake off sleep and creep through the chill to the flap of the tent, where he would stand and listen to the sound of his master's breathing. But in spite of his great love, he bore John Thornton, which seemed to bespeak the soft, civilizing influence, the strain of the primitive which the Northland had aroused in him, remained alive and active. Faithfulness and devotion, things born of fire and roof, were his. Yet, his retained his wildness and willingness. He was a thing of the wild, coming from the wild to sit by John Thornton's fire, rather than a dog of the soft Southland stamped with the marks of generations of civilization. Because of his great love, he could not steal from this man, but from any other man in any other camp, he did not hesitate an instant, while the cunning with which he stole enabled him to escape detection. His face and body were scored by teeth of many dogs, and he fought as fiercely as ever and more shrewdly. Skeet and Nig were too good natured, besides, they belonged to John Thornton. But the strange dog, no matter what the breed or valor, swiftly acknowledged Buck's supremacy or found himself struggling for life with the terrible antagonist. And Buck was merciless. He had learned well the law of club and fang, and he never forewent an advantage or drew back from a foe. He had started on the way to death. He had lessoned from Spitz and from the chief fighting dog of the police and mail, and he knew there was no middle course. He must master or be mastered, while to show mercy was weakness. Mercy did not exist in the primordial life. It was misunderstood for fear, and such misunderstandings made for death. Kill or be killed, eat or be eaten was the law, and his mandate down out of the depths of time he obeyed. He was older than the days he had seen and the breaths he had drawn. He linked the past with the present, and the eternity behind him throbbed through him in a mighty rhythm to which he swayed as the tides and the seasons swayed. He sat by John Thornton's fire, a broad breasted dog, white fanged and long furred, but behind him were the shades of all manner of dogs, half wolves and wild wolves, urgent and prompting, tasting the savor of the meat he ate, thirsting for the water he drank, scenting the wild with him, listening with him, and telling him the sounds made by the wildlife in the forest, dictating his moods, directing his actions, lying down to sleep with him when he lay down, and dreaming with him and beyond him, and becoming themselves the stuff of his dreams. So peremptorily did these shades beckon him that each day mankind and the claims of mankind slipped further from him. Deep in the forest, a call was sounding. And as often as he heard this call, mysteriously thrilling and luring, he felt compelled to turn his back upon the fire and beaten earth around it, and to plunge into the forest, and on and on. He knew not where or why, or did he wonder where or why, the call sounding imperiously deep in the forest. But as often as he gained the soft, unbroken earth and the green shade, the love for John Thornton drew him back to the fire again. Thornton alone held him. The rest of mankind was nothing. Chance travelers might praise or pet him, but he was cold under it all. And from a too demonstrative man, he would get up and walk away. When Thornton's partners Hans and Pete arrived on the long expected raft, Buck refused to notice them till he learned they were close to Thornton. After that, he tolerated them in a passive sort of way, accepting favors from them as though he favored them by accepting. They were of the same large type as Thornton, living close to the earth, thinking simply and seeing clearly. And ere they swung the raft into the big eddy by the sawmill at Dawson, they understood Buck and his ways and did not insist upon intimacy such as obtained with Skeet and Nig. For Thornton, however, his love seemed to grow and grow. He alone among the men could put a pack upon Buck's back in the summer traveling. Nothing was too great for Buck to do when Thornton commanded. One day they had grub stalked themselves from the proceeds of the raft and left Dawson for the headwaters of Tanana. The men and dogs were sitting on the crest of a cliff which fell away straight down to naked bedrock 300 feet below. John Thornton was sitting near the edge, Buck at his shoulder. A thoughtless whim seized Thornton, and he drew the attention of Hans and Pete at the experiment he had in mind. Jump, Buck, he commanded, sweeping his arm out and over the chasm. The next instant he was grappling with Buck on the extreme edge, while Hans and Pete were dragging them back into safety. It's uncanny, Pete said after it was over, that they had caught their speech. Thornton shook his head. No, it's splendid, and it is terrible, too. Do you know, it sometimes makes me afraid. I'm not hankering to be the man that lays hands on you while he's around, Pete announced conclusively, nodding his head towards Buck. By Jingo was Hans' contribution, not mine self either. It was at Circle City, ere that year was out, that Pete's apprehensions were realized. Black Burton, a man evil tempered and malicious, had been picking a quarrel with Tenderfoot at the bar when Thornton stepped good naturedly between. Buck, as was his custom, was lying in a corner, head on paws, watching his master's every action. Burton struck out, without warning, straight from the shoulder. Thornton was sent spinning and swayed himself from falling only by clutching the rail of the bar. Those who were looking on heard what was neither bark or yelp, but a something which is best described as a roar, and they saw Buck's body rise up in the air as he left floor for Burton's throat. The man saved his life by instinctively throwing out his arm, but was hurled backwards to the floor with Buck on top of him. Buck loosened his teeth from the flesh of the arm and drove in again for the throat. This time the man succeeded only in partly blocking, and his throat was torn open. When the crowd was upon Buck and he was driven off, but while a surgeon checked the bleeding, he crawled up and down, growling furiously, attempting to rush in, and being forced back by an array of hostile clubs. A miners' meeting called on the spot decided that the dog had sufficient provocation and Buck was discharged, but his reputation was made, and from that day his name spread through every camp in Alaska. Later on, in the fall of the year, he saved John Thornton's life in quite another fashion. The three partners were lining a long and narrow poling boat down a bad stretch of rapids on the 40-mile creek. Hans and Pete moved along the bank, snubbed with a thin manila rope from tree to tree, while Thornton remained in the boat, helping its descent by the means of a pole and shouting directions to the shore. Buck on the bank, worried and anxious, kept abreast of the boat, his eyes never off his master. At a particularly bad spot where the ledge of barely submerged rock jutted out into the river, Hans cast off the rope and, while Thornton poled the boat out into the stream, ran down the bank with the end in his hand to snub the boat when it had cleared the ledge. This it did, and was flying downstream in a current as swift as mill race, when Hans checked it with the rope and checked too suddenly. The boat flirted over and snubbed into the bank bottom up, while Thornton, flung sheer out of it, was carried downstream towards the worst part of the rapids, a stretch of wild water in which no swimmer could live. Buck had sprung in on the instant, and at the end of 300 yards, amid a mad swell of water, he overhauled Thornton. When he felt his grasp his tail, Buck headed for the bank, swimming with all his splendid strength. But the progress shoreward was slow, the progress downstream amazingly rapid. From below came the fatal roaring where the wild current went wilder and was rent in shreds and spray by the rocks which thrust through like the teeth of an enormous comb. The suck of the water as it took the beginning of the last steep pitch was frightful, and Thornton knew that the shore was impossible. He scraped furiously over a rock, bruised across a second, and struck a third with crushing force. He clutched its slippery top with both hands, releasing Buck, and above the roar of churning water shouted, "Go, Buck, go!" Buck could not hold his own and swept on downstream, struggling desperately but unable to win back. When he heard Thornton's command repeated, he partly reared out of the water, throwing his head high as though for a last look, then turned obediently towards the bank. He swam powerfully and was dragged ashore by Pete and Hans at the very point where swimming ceased to be possible and destruction began. They knew that the time a man could cling to a slippery rock in the face of that driving current was a matter of minutes, and they ran as fast as they could up the bank to a point far above where Thornton was hanging on. They attached the line with which they had been snubbing the boat to Buck's neck and shoulders, being careful that it should neither strangle him nor impede his swimming, and launched him into the stream. He struck out boldly, but not straight enough into the stream. He discovered the mistake too late, when Thornton was abreast of him and bare half dozen strokes away while he was being carried helplessly past. Hands promptly snubbed with the rope as though Buck were a boat. The rope thus tightening on him in sweep of the current, he was jerked under the surface, and under the surface he remained till his body struck against the bank and he was hauled out. He was half drowned, and Hans and Pete threw themselves upon him, pounding the breath into him and the water out of him. He staggered to his feet and fell down. The faint sound of Thornton's voice came to them, and though they could not make out the words of it, they knew that he was in his extremity. His master's voice acted on Bucks like an electric shock. He sprung to his feet and ran up the bank ahead of the men to the point of his previous departure. Again the rope was attached and he was launched, and again he struck out, but this time straight into the stream. He had miscalculated once, but he would not be guilty of it the second time.